We are going to listen to Professor John Torday from the University of California.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, okay, great.
Okay, I'm sorry I was in the wrong venue.
Okay.
I was in the other room.
Welcome.
Okay. So I have a PowerPoint.
Yes.
I have not done this before, so I do the share screen.
Share screen, yes.
Okay. And how do I find my PowerPoint? Okay.
Yes, we see it.
Great. Okay.
Okay, please.
Well, thank you very much for allowing me to present. Everything I'm about to talk about is based upon experimental evidence that I've acquired over the last 50 years, along with my colleagues in the field of developmental biology as it applies to physics. So as background, in 2019, I published a paper on the singularity of nature based on the foundational interrelationship between the inanimate and the animate, the atom and the cell being homologs. That is to say, they're both of the same origin. The key to understanding this approach is the cellular molecular mechanism for development based on cell-cell communication, mediated by soluble growth factors signaling to their receptors, first observed and published when I was in graduate school. Since that time, so I should specify, in the late 60s and early 70s. Since that time, the essential elements of embryologic development have been determined, particularly for the lung, which is existential for life outside of the womb. Embryologic development is the only mechanism we know of for the formation of structure and function. The key elements for the development of the alveoli, the site where gas exchange occurs in the lung, have been determined. Using that as the basis for reverse engineering the lung, it was possible to move backwards in space and time developmentally and phylogenetically to the unicellular state. Based on that approach, many other key physiologic properties, such as the kidney, the heart, skeleton, and brain, for example, have all been traced back to the unicellular state. In the aggregate, the evolution of the physiology has now been traced forward from the unicellular state to the present state. So this is a schematic showing the relationship between the phylogeny, in this case of the lung, that is through speciation, the evolution from the swim bladder of fish to the lungs of amphibia, reptiles, and mammals, schematically shown, and in tandem is what happens at the alveolar level with the increase in the surface area to blood volume ratio of the alveoli, increasing gas exchange. If you apply the Einsteinian formula for energy, equaling to mass times the square of the speed of light, to these properties, which actually represent a transfer of energy, when you actually apply the principles to the signaling mechanisms that are responsible for this change, both phylogenetically and ontogenetically, matter falls by the wayside. It's no longer relevant, and all you have left is energy. So there's energy flow as a vector, beginning at the origin, at the Big Bang, and advancing through life as a process of energy exchange. So here I'm showing those relationships in other tissues and organs. So I started with the lung here at the top. Same processes occur in the heart. You go from a simplified vessel to a three-chambered heart in amphibians, and then a four-chambered heart in mammals. And this is a three-chambered heart in birds. And similarly, you see that the kidney evolved from a simple glomus in fish, shown here on the left, and then it advanced through the process of increased vascularization to form the glomeruli in the mammalian kidney. And each one of these processes follows the same principles of cell-cell communication, as did the lung. So here's the thermodynamic narrative for all of that. If we start with the concept of the Big Bang, basically we start with a singularity, and then we generate a vector, starting with at point zero, radiating out as the expanding universe or cosmos. We know that that meteorites containing water and polycyclic hydrocarbons, lipids, produced by pulsars struck the Earth about 4 billion years ago, generating the ocean that covered the planet. So when these lipids align at the air-liquid interface, the air-water interface, lipids are zwitterions that have negative and positive charge. And when they're packed and perpendicular to the surface of the water, they actually reduce the surface tension of water. And you have this polarized structure, which then I hypothesize through the effects of pulsars, electromagnetic force upon these molecules, generates what are called micelles. They are simple prototypical cells with a semi-permeable membrane surrounding them. And within that structure, you can allow for negative entropy, Schrodinger's idea of the origin of life, the force vitale. So negative entropy, which goes against the principles, the second law of thermodynamics, fueled by chemiosmosis, the aligning of ions along an internal membrane to generate bioenergy. And all of that is being regulated by homeostasis. Homeostasis originating from the Big Bang. The homeostatic force is actually the equal and opposite reaction, Newton's third law of motion. So homeostasis is determining the existence of this structure. And as these primitive micelles floating at the surface of the water, because they are, because of their density, they do float as lipids. They're warmed by day and cooled by night. And in the process, these structures will deform and then reform when they're warmed and then when they're cooled. And in the process, they will capture calcium ions and they will accumulate those calcium ions such that a subset of these micelles will then essentially evolve the capacity to mediate calcium flux. And that this is the origin of the calcium channels that maintain the integrity of all cells subsequently. So, and the way that it is thought that life itself has evolved is through these micellar structures dealing with existential threats within the environment and internalizing them, endogenizing them. So here I'm talking about X, Y, and Z. And this iterative process ultimately gives rise to what we think of as physiology. This is Lynn Margulis's theory of endosymbiogenesis. And when unicellular life has dominated the Earth for about 3.5 billion years, it's only in the last 500 million years that multicellular organisms have existed. And the way in which they have evolved is through cell-cell communication as energy flow, as I said earlier. And the reason I say that is because as these cells evolve, they produce soluble growth factors, which then bind to a target cell, shown here, through a specific receptor, and they generate high energy phosphates, such as cyclic adenosine phosphate and inositol phosphates. So you're going from one cell to another through this energy flow as the principal means of evolving. This is just an overview of what embryogenesis looks like. So we're going from the zygote to the offspring and the intermediate steps. And each one of these steps represents a stage in the transfer of energy until finally you have the offspring being given birth to. So the idea here is that, so unicellular structures internalize their environment. This is referred to in biology as niche construction. So now you have the internalization of environmental factors in a way in which it allows for the cell to accommodate the environment. And so now you have a continuum from the organism to its environment. So for example, you have beavers building dams and creating their own environment. And similarly, we humans do the same thing. There's this wonderful quote from Simon Conway Morris: "First there were bacteria, now there is New York." So you start with bacteria, and over the course of evolution, you have New York City. I know it's a hyperbole, but it basically is what's happened. And the way that that's occurred is that you have the organism, the unicellular and then multicellular organisms, internalizing factors in the environment which have to comply with the laws of nature. So exponentially iterating this process gives rise to, ultimately, to consciousness and ultimately to cosmic consciousness, because all of these properties have to comply with the laws of nature. So what I'm saying is, if you think of the cell as a fractal, these fractals actually are fractals of the cosmos, and therefore everything operates based upon the same laws of nature. So I think of it this way. As I said, if the cell is a fractal, if we think of a puzzle pieces with their faces up so you see the images, you can formulate, we can form these patterns of ontogeny and phylogeny based upon cell-cell communication, as I'm showing here on the right. But if the puzzle pieces are face down, so you don't have any images, you cannot reconstruct what has occurred over the course of evolution. So in other words, the images are giving you clues as to how life has formed from its component parts. And ultimately, evolution can be thought of as language, and that ultimately civilization and culture are the derivative of these cell-cell communications. So if you start with the cell-cell communications I showed earlier, and you generate complicated structures, and they in turn evolve the ability to control their own body temperature, endothermy, that gives rise to bipedalism. And ultimately, this is covered, sorry about that. The bipedalism is critical because it frees the forelimbs of quadrupeds for tool making. And that in turn gives rise to oral communication, because if the hands are preoccupied and cannot just gesture, you have to develop some other way of communicating. And that in turn gave rise to written communication as the confluence, as the synergy between language and tool making. And I feel strongly that language and tool making are in fact homologs, because the area of Broca in the cerebrum actually is where both fine motor skills and language dwell. So there's a structural homologue for all of this. So ultimately the evolution, if you will, of written communication has been critical for the generation of civilization and culture. So you see a continuum from the unicellular state all the way to civilization and culture. And that in turn feeds back on the cellular mechanisms in order to promote them as a synergistic process. So there's this synergistic interaction between all of these properties as a hierarchical vertical integration of all these properties. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor John Torday, for your interesting perspective. Unfortunately, we have to stop here. We don't have time for questions, but probably later we can have the opportunity to discuss about your interesting talk.